Good morning, everybody. I hope you'll stick around. We're going to be talking about somebody who, a woman who should have probably won the Nobel Prize in economics. I'm biased, though, being based here at Girton. I'm Kamyar Mohadas. I'm a Genoway Fellow in economics and a fellow at Girton. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Lord John Eatwell, who you might know is currently the president of Queen's College, and also been here for many years. I won't reveal how many. But what's interesting, you might find interesting, is that his first book, An Introduction to Modern Economics, was actually written jointly with Joan Robinson. So I'm not going to take up his time. Thank you for joining us, John.
Well, thanks very much, everybody. Imagine that you're a second-year undergraduate in economics, walking in for your first theory lectures at the beginning of the Michaelmas term, to be given by Joan Robinson. And you already knew that of the top, say, dozen economists who've ever lived, from Adam Smith onwards, there was one woman, which was Joan Robinson, in that team. So you were ready to be impressed. But then you walked into the lecture hall and you found that the first 3 rows were taken up with visiting professors. And this is your second-year undergraduate introductory theory course. And then into the lecture hall walks this medium-height woman in her 60s, silver-haired, wearing sort of Indian or Pakistani clothes, sort of baggy trousers with a long tunic. And then there starts a series of 16 lectures which changed my life. I mean, a series of discussions on economic theory which were just searing in the way that they cut through to really important issues and gave an entirely new insight into what economic theory was about. Because Joan Robinson was a theorist, and it may be helpful if I just sort of comment on what economic theory is like. Economic theory consists of trying to understand the economy as a system. It was Adam Smith who first characterized the economy as having some sort of systematic rules of behavior that it's the job of economists to find out. But the way that economists try to characterize these rules operates on 2 different levels. On the one hand, they try to do empirical studies and find out. But what Adam Smith said is that that sort of empirical work isn't enough. The other thing they do is try to build models which characterize those rules which they think are embedded in the actual economy. And extraordinarily, these are deductive models. You start from a series of assumptions which you try to suggest characterizes the way the economy actually works, and then you try to work out, if those assumptions are right, how would it work? What would the rules be embedded in this system? So, for example, the proposition that prices are determined by supply and demand, which is what most people know about economics, at the sort of simplest level, is both an attempted empirical statement, but it's also a theoretical statement. And the theory is very sophisticated and mathematically complex. It's actually extremely difficult to prove that prices are determined by supply and demand in a deductive mathematical sense. But so you have the empirical and the theoretical. And Joan Robinson was a theorist. But she was a theorist who wanted to connect theory with the world in a way that I'll discuss in a moment. Joan Morris, as she was then, graduated from Girton in 1925. She didn't, with a 2-1, by the way, for those who want to sort of be cheered up. She, of course, didn't receive a degree because no women received degrees at the University of Cambridge until 1946, when the Queen Mother received the first ever Cambridge degree for a woman. In 1926, just after graduating, she married Austin Robinson, also an economist, became Joan Robinson, and the two of them went off to India for 2 years. During her time as an undergraduate, she had learned the standard Cambridge fare, the orthodox economics derived from the works of Alfred Marshall, a straightforward analysis of the firm, of individuals, which characterized the economy as a self-functioning, self-managed system, an automatic system which would ensure that markets cleared and that goods were distributed in a particular way. And also, within Marshall, there was a theory of the firm. So it characterized how individuals worked, how firms worked. And the theory of the firm said that a firm would grow to a certain size until it hit diminishing returns. So as its costs started to rise, then the firm would stop, and other firms would come in, which would be smaller, and then they would grow up to this size where costs start to rise, and then they would stop. And so there was this model of the firm, which Joan Robinson absorbed was the Cambridge orthodoxy everybody believed. When she returned to Cambridge 2 years later, that model of the firm had been blown out of the water by a man called Piero Sraffa, who was an Italian brought to Cambridge by Keynes, and who at that time was doing some casual supervising at King's and otherwise had no official position in the university. And he had said, why do costs start to rise? And nobody had asked that question. He said, look, if this is a competitive economy, you can go on buying resources. You don't have to stick with what you have. You can always replicate the production system you have at the moment. There's no reason for costs to rise. And if there's no reason for costs to rise, then in a competitive economy, then there's no definition of how big a firm will be. It could be any size, because that limitation will never appear. And at the end of this article, which blew a hole in the Cambridge orthodoxy of the time, Sraffa said, it's necessary, therefore, to abandon the path of free competition and turn in the opposite direction, namely towards monopoly. And Joan Robinson, coming back, discovered this new turmoil in Cambridge economics and set it on a different path. Within the next 4 years, she'd written a book called The Economics of Imperfect Competition, where she developed a whole analysis of firms which were not in just competitive markets, weren't monopolies, but were in sort of imperfectly competitive markets. Markets where firms had some degree of influence on what they did. They weren't just price takers from the competitive world. They could actually manipulate their market a bit, but then they actually had influences on each other. They weren't pure monopolies where you could manipulate your market totally. And so she developed a whole structure, a new structure of analysis, and invented a whole series of tools which are still used by economists today. I mean, she invented, if any economists are here, it was Joan Robinson who invented the idea of the elasticity of substitution. And it was Joan Robinson who developed the whole analysis of the relationship between marginal cost and marginal revenue in the equilibrium of the firm. This had never been done before. And so she published this book in 1933 and instantly became an international economics superstar, because she had created, from the stimulus which Sraffa had given, she had created an entirely new way of looking at industry, of looking at firms, and of analyzing them on a theoretical level. Interestingly enough, at the same time, a man called Edward Chamberlain at Harvard, also about the same age as Joan, he was a young man, wrote a book called The Theory of Monopolistic Competition. and it was essentially the same. It was a notion of dual discovery. But then the reaction was different. Poor old Edward Chamberlain spent his life, literally his whole life, and he lived into his 80s, differentiating himself from Joan Robinson. 4 years after Joan Robinson published The Economics of Imperfect Competition and became world famous, she wrote an article where she said, "I reject that book. I've given it up. I've taken another turn." The key influence now was the other iconoclastic figure in Cambridge, John Maynard Keynes. This was the time of the Great Depression, of high levels in the United States, with 25% unemployment in the United States, high levels of unemployment and depression in Britain as well. And the models of Marshall said that if there was unemployment, this must be because the market is prevented from doing its job. It must be because workers are holding wages too high. Or it must be because there are monopolies which don't actually allow prices to fall, where output would rise and more people would be employed. In other words, there are imperfections in the market which are preventing the market doing its job and pushing the economy back towards full employment. And this indeed was the guide to the policies which were pursued by the governments of the time, including the Labour government. There are high levels of unemployment, cut wages. If you can force the unions to cut wages, then more people will be employed and the level of activity will rise. Keynes came along and said, that's wrong. If you cut wages, all you're doing is cutting demand for other goods. If you cut wages, all you'll do is be in a downward spiral with output falling and wages falling. And he developed a completely new idea. His idea was called the principle of effective demand. And he said that to analyze the level of employment in the economy, you've got to look at the components of demand. One element of the demand is the consumption of those workers whose wages you're cutting. Another key element of demand is the investment of firms. And you've got to think, why do firms invest? And what discourages them from investing? And a third item of demand can, of course, be the government spending itself. And so Keynes developed an entirely new model where it was normal for the economy to be less than fully employed, and it was normal for there to be no new forces pushing the economy towards full employment. It could just stick there, and nothing would move it. It would just stay with high levels of unemployment. Now, in what Keynes called his struggle to escape from the ideas of Marshall, from which he himself has imbibed as even earlier years than Joan Robinson, Keynes carried into the general theory a lot of his old Marshallian apparatus. And it severely weakened the message. For example, he embodied in the idea that perhaps if interest rates could fall sufficiently, then investment demand would rise and there'd be a nice functional relationship which would drive the economy towards full employment. So maybe markets would work after all. But maybe, money markets are uncertain, so they won't work very well. Now, Joan Robinson worked very closely with Keynes and with some other young economists in Cambridge in producing the general theory. They were what was called a circus. Keynes would write a chapter, he would give it to this young team, they would go off and discuss it, and then they would report back to the master as to how he'd got it wrong and how he should change this chapter and so on and so forth. And Joan Robinson was a key member of this circus which created Keynes's general theory. And I believe that what is very clear in her subsequent writings is that Joan Robinson actually understood the revolutionary character of what Keynes was saying better than Keynes did himself. She realized that once you actually look at an economy and think about its operation being driven by demand, by the demand that comes through from those three elements I described, from consumption, investment, and the government. The whole story, by the way, was created in an economy without significant international trade, which was rather a bad idea for Britain at the time. But anyhow, it was created as if the economy was one world. The issues of exports and imports and their impact on the whole story was something that Joan Robinson was to take up in a quite revolutionary manner later on. But Joan took up this revolutionary idea, and to give you a notion of how relevant some of her ideas about this are today, she wrote an article in 1937 called The Economics of Disguised Unemployment. And she pointed out that if you have an economy where there is no social security, that if you're unemployed, you either starve or you go and live with a relative who happens to have some form of job and helps you keep going, or perhaps in a rural economy, you go back to the countryside and live on a farm and just get by. There will be no unemployment. If there's no way of living without working, you can't have people who are unemployed. And so she pointed out, and her example was this: suppose there is someone who used to work in a factory, who used to be a highly productive worker, and now because demand is too low, there is no demand for the products of that factory, and there's no demand, therefore, for the workers of that factory, and this individual is selling matches in the Strand. That was her example. It was a he in the writing of the time. He is selling matches in the Strand. Right? Or, let's take it to today. He is delivering pizza. She is driving an Uber car. Right? If you don't have sufficient demand, people find a way of getting by. And it's very striking that if you look at the UK today, where social security has been significantly reduced from the cushion that it used to be, we see at the same time the rise of what have been called Mac jobs. Jobs where people are working below their potential because there is not sufficient demand. It's disguised unemployment, said Joan Robinson in 1937. So this is a picture of the economy which characterized it as driven by the level of demand. And as I say, she took Keynes's story and applied it in ways which Keynes himself really hadn't developed at all. But then, after the Keynesian Revolution, so to speak, in the 1930s, which then went on as the basic framework, the analytical framework for financing the Second World War, and the analytical framework for sustaining full employment from 1945 up until the 1970s. That was the framework had been created. But Joan Robinson wrote a series of articles saying there was something wrong with this theory. There was something incomplete about this new characterization of which she had been part of the creation. And the thing that she said was incomplete was this: the basic theory that markets will automatically drive the economy towards full employment had been described by Keynes as a special theory. He said the general theory, his theory, was that the economy would settle at levels below full employment. But there was a special theory, when the economy was fully employed, where the old models were right, where Marshall could come back again, whereas the neoclassical story, as it's called, of Marshallian theory, could come back again. And so the price theory that Keynes used, the analysis of how prices are determined, was still the Marshallian theory that prices were determined by the balance of supply and demand. Now, the idea that prices are determined by the balance of supply and demand doesn't just apply to goods in shops, but in terms of the whole theory applies to the labor market and the market for capital and the market for land. So the labor market in the Marshallian orthodoxy cleared with the balance of supply and demand. The wage was determined by the balance of supply and demand for labor. The demand for labor from employers and the supply of labor from those who are looking for a job. And the wage will be determined as the balance. Now, Joan Robinson forcefully pointed out that this cannot be true. It cannot be true because if the economy is normally not fully employed, there is no balance. And so not is there only no balance between the quantity of labor demanded and the quantity of labor supplied because there are many workers unemployed, but if there's no balance, what determines the wage? Because the whole theory was the wage would be determined by this balance of supply and demand for labor. So the whole theory that wages were determined in that way, that price was determined in that way, cannot be right. And she puzzled over this and picked at it and worked at it in a whole series of articles, and also pointed out that if wages weren't determined by supply and demand, then no other prices were either, because wages were the prominent component of the costs of other goods. And so the costs of other goods, their prices, must be determined predominantly by wages, but wages weren't determined by supply and demand, therefore those prices weren't determined by supply and demand. Now, to say that this is iconoclastic is to put it mildly. I mean, this was going way out in left field from what was the core of economics, because economics had sort of absorbed Keynes's message, had turned it into a theory of rigidities in wages and monopoly prices preventing the economy moving towards full employment, or perhaps inappropriate monetary policies, all a theory of imperfections. A theory of imperfections which you could say, if we remove those imperfections, then the economy will move to full employment. So Keynes had sort of been neutered. Keynes had been moved into the orthodox mainstream. But Joan Robinson, who I said I believe understood Keynes better than he did himself, stayed outside. And she said, this cannot be right, because if unemployment is the normal condition, it cannot be true that wages are determined by supply and demand, and therefore it cannot be true that prices are determined by supply and demand. And through the war years and into the 1940s, and she picked away at this, puzzled away at this. And then in the early 1950s, she got the answer. In 1954, she published a highly theoretical article called The Production Function and the Theory of Capital. Now, the whole story of wages determined by supply and demand is the idea that labor is substituted with other means of production as prices change. So typically, labor and capital are substituted for one another. So if you have very high wages, you may use less labor and more capital. If you have very low wages, you use more labor and less capital. The one is substituted for another. And in the sort of mathematical structures of economic theory, this is expressed in a thing called a production function. You say output is a function of capital and labor. And the function describes all the different proportions that labor and capital can be combined in as the basis of the production system. And Joan looked at this and she said, okay, output is a function of labor, L. I know what labor is. Labor is hours of work that are available. It's the number of people who are available, the set of their skills, That's what labor is. What is capital in this little model? What is it? Given that the price of capital was to be the rate of profit, and the price of labor was to be the wage, and the rate of profit is a pure number, 5%, 10%, return on the value of capital. So the only way that this story makes sense is if the K in the equation, capital, is measured as a quantity of value. But hang on, this is supposed to be the basis of our theory of how prices are determined. You don't know what the value of anything is until you've found prices. You can't have the value before you determine prices. You'll be arguing in a circle. And so Joan wrote this article, heavily theoretical piece, saying the whole story is flawed. The whole story of substitution between capital and labor involves arguing in a circle. This was the next bomb thrown into the body of then Orthodox economics. Her opponents were Paul Samuelson at MIT and Robert Solow at MIT, the two really prominent economists of the era. And Paul Samuelson had written the textbook in 1948, which shaped everybody's view of economics. And they said, you're wrong. You've got this wrong, Joan Robinson. You don't know enough maths. You can't, you know, if you knew enough mathematics, you would be able to solve this thing. And so the debate went on and on about whether she'd actually created just a false trail, or whether she'd actually found that the core of economic analysis was flawed. And in 1966, she won. In 1966, in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, there was a symposium on what was called capital theory, where Paul Samuelson said, you won. You got it right. Now, it is extraordinary that, in fact, this era, these things which are called Capital Controversies, which go at the very core of how economists think about how the economy works, has not really been absorbed even to this very day. The proposition that prices, theoretically, the theory tells you that prices are determined by supply and demand, is still taught to undergraduates in universities throughout the world, including this one. I actually think it's a disgrace, but there we go. So Joan had actually developed a critique of the very foundations of orthodox theory, and her journey had come from Imperfect Competition, where she wrote the book that everybody uses today, and then just rejected it. That was a false start, she said. Then the ideas of Keynes, of the economy works in an entirely different way from the automatically functioning mechanism that orthodox theory portrayed it as. And then to this fundamental criticism of the foundation of orthodox modeling. Now, all this, you may feel, particularly those of you who are not economists, that this is really airy-fairy stuff. I mean, this doesn't seem to relate to the foundations of our economic problems today. Well, maybe that disguised unemployment story, that's an important story. But all this capital theory stuff and whether prices determine this way seems rather abstract. And so I'd just like to focus on another piece of work that Joan Robinson did. I mentioned that when Joan graduated, she, of course, didn't receive a Cambridge degree because women didn't. Then in 1965, at the age of 62, she became a professor. Right? People expect to be professors in their 30s these days. Right? At the age of 62, she became a professor. And like Nancy Astor, she succeeded her husband. He stood down as professor of economics, retired, Austin Robinson, after a distinguished career, and Joan took over her husband's chair. So there's a certain story here. But then she gave an inaugural lecture, as professors used to do. They don't seem to do it so much these days, where you stand up and you present your view of the world as you're a new professor. And she called it the new mercantilism. And she said that the world was threatened by the new mercantilism. And what was this? The idea was this. Suppose now, instead of looking at an economy as if it just has no rest of the world, as Keynes had done, that we now project it into the world. And we look at the economy trading with the rest of the world. Now, if it sells more than it buys, it makes a surplus. If it buys more than it sells, it makes a deficit. If you sell more than you buy, and you make a surplus from your trading partners in the rest of the world, clearly you are doing well. And if that is your objective, that is a sort of mercantilist objective. The mercantilists were Tudor economists who believed that the accumulation of gold was the foundation of economics. Adam Smith came along and said, no, it isn't. It's the ability to produce is the foundation of economics. But here we have an economy that has a surplus, and it's accumulating money from the rest of the world. But if one economy is selling more than it buys, somewhere in the world there's one that must be buying more than it sells, right? And it's got to balance out somehow. So the economies that are buying more than they sell, how do they do that? Well, they have to borrow. They have to cover the difference by borrowing from the rest of the world. Unless, and there's one specific circumstance, unless you can print your own money and everybody will take it anyhow. And so we see the phenomenon today that the United States runs a huge deficit with China, and the Chinese, in return, receive bits of paper printed green. So they supply electrical goods, they supply railway equipment, they supply a whole range of goods to the United States, and in return they get bits of paper printed green because they're willing to accept dollars. But typically, people can't borrow easily in their own currency, so you can't just print it. And so you have to borrow from others and you build up debts. So we have a world which consists of those which are doing terribly well and have a nice surplus, and those who are struggling a bit and are borrowing to make their way. As the governor of the Bank of England said about the UK economy recently, we live on the generosity of strangers. So in this situation, the economy that's in deficit has to try and get rid of its deficit. It has to try and have its citizens buy fewer imports and perhaps be a bit more productive and produce some more exports. And so how do you stop your citizens buying imports? You impoverish them, raise their taxes, lower their level of income, lower the overall level of activity in the economy. And if you do that, they'll buy less imports, and as long as you can sell the same amount, maybe then you won't have a deficit anymore. But of course, if you don't have a deficit, the surplus countries just lost its surplus as well. And so how may they react? Well, let's try and get back the surplus. And so we will deflate our economy. And so the whole world has a deflationary bias. This is, said Joan Robinson in 1965, the new mercantilism. And the only way you can escape from this is either to have one country which is willing to spend like it's going out of style and everybody will take its bits of paper printed green. In other words, it can just maintain demand in the world without people saying, we won't buy from you anymore, we won't even sell to you anymore because we don't take your money, you've got to borrow from others. Unless you have that, the only way to get out of this is to have a degree of cooperation on a world scale, a degree of cooperation as to how you adjust demand in the world economy in a way that will sustain the level of demand. And that's what the Allies tried to do in the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 at the end of the war, a conference dominated on the British side by Keynes, and actually rather successfully managed in the immediate post-war era. But Joan Robinson said in 1965, this structure still has a potential to lead to world depression. And if, as is happening today, the degree of cooperation diminishes, if instead of having a multilateral rules-based system, we go to bilateral deals, then there is the potential for a steady decline in the world economy. There will be a persistent tendency to deflation and higher levels of unemployment. It was the Keynesian message taken onto the international stage in 1965, but oh so relevant today. There was another idea that dominated Joan's life, which was the relationship between theory and the applied world. And she hated theories which were sort of closed systems. They were just equilibrium with no history, as she put it. And she said, what you need are theories which can incorporate institutional change. Keynes's whole theory of employment required the institutions of a modern monetary system. Otherwise, the theory doesn't make sense. And that system can change, in which case the whole structure of employment and employment policy would change. Similarly, the classical theorists, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, had theories which embodied institutions and history. They were sort of open models. They were behavioral bits of what we could call abstract theory, but on the outside, they had built around them institutional and historical stories. And so she argued throughout her life that we need to have a theory of history rather than equilibrium. But Joan Robinson devoted her life really to economic theory because she thought economic theory was so important. Actually, she once said, it's very important to learn economic theory so that you won't be fooled by economists. She felt that this was an important component. She would have rejected the idea common today that there's a thing called orthodox economics and a thing called heterodox economics. She'd have said there's good economics and there's bad economics. And it's good economics that she tried to develop. She was an extraordinarily powerful personality. Sometimes she could be extremely rude. Well, let's say very direct. As, for example, and for those of you of delicate persuasion, you can put your fingers in your ears for a moment on this one. I went with her to Chicago in 1976, I think it was, and she had a debate with Milton Friedman, where she said, now, Milton, don't give me any of that monetarist shit. You can imagine the American undergraduates in the audience. There's this silver-haired granny, and they just couldn't believe what was happening. So she could be very direct and very rude, and certainly made a lot of enemies. But she also was the most extraordinarily powerful intellect and powerful personality who managed to change economics for the better and to provide a framework in which economics could actually contribute to making this a better world. What a great Girtonian. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. I read recently an interview in the New York Times in 1976, I think, and they asked exactly this thing to Joan about maths in economics, and her answer was, "I don't know math," she said, "so I'm obliged to think." And I think that was quite to the point. Anyways, we have a few minutes for questions. If you John, happy to take. We take should I take 2 or 3 and then?
Yeah, take 2 or 3.
Yeah, and then we close it.
Yeah.
As a person who works in finance and banking, it's great to hear stories of women who actually were very progressive in these types of fields. But then there's the personal side, right? She was married to a well-known economist as well. By chance, might you know how she would get through all the challenges, how she would still stay strong and resilient? I think resiliency is so important in a field like what she was in.
Okay.
The 3 of us came up in 1965, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on her teaching style, because I remember her sitting in the buttery with a huge teapot, and any comers could come challenge her, and she was always, in those days, surrounded by a group of men, of course, being challenged. So part of her style appeared to be testing out what she was saying, arguing the toss. Was that a general way of teaching and interacting?
One last one. Maybe take 2.
Thank you. I'm wondering which economies have actually taken on Joan Robinson's ideas, which governments are actually putting into practice her insights.
I'm going to be cheeky and take the last one over there.
With the digital technology revolution, to what extent do the ideas that she promulgated, to what extent would that have changed the landscape that she was working in?
Okay. And what is that gentleman there has been standing up? Perhaps
that's the most lucid lecture on economics I've heard for a very long time. You didn't have time to say much about her as a person. She once sort of both intimidated and flattered me, and I wanted to comment on something else. I used to be, I should say, the head of the Department of War Studies at King's College London and the director of Chatham House. There's a thing called the Lees-Knowles Lectures at Cambridge, sponsored by Trinity, and I was asked, back about 1980, later than that maybe, to give the Lees-Knowles Lectures on the question of the role of nuclear weapons in the world today. And it was rather strange because you gave them a fortnight apart from each other and had dinner at Trinity in between. I was very surprised to see Joan Robinson in the center of the front row and rather intimidated. But I felt flattered that she came to the second and third lectures as well. What about her views on the world other than strictly economic? That didn't get much attention because you had so much else to say.
I want to take Angela as well here. Sorry. Angela's from Washington.
So now I'm just going to add on to that. So I came up here in 1966, and I remember vividly, it was either in 68 or 69, at a big sit-in that we had where Joan Robinson came, and she was the heroine of those of us protesting. Could you say something about the link between her economic theory and her economic life and her political life?
Good luck, John.
Okay. Now, for those of you who are ready to stay till 11 o'clock this evening, first of all, resilience. As I said, she had an extraordinary internal toughness. She came from a very, let us say, how can I describe it? A very both tight family, but also a family of enormous, clear values. I think it was her grandfather, who was General Morris in the First World War, was the focus of a major controversy in 1918, because he wrote a letter to the Times saying the government was faking the casualty figures on the Western Front. And then an earlier Morris was the evangelical Christian reformer in the mid-19th century. So it was a family of sort of deep personal values, in which it seemed also that women were valued within this structure, within this family. But she was a very eccentric, powerful character. I mean, for example, right towards the end of her life, she slept in an open-sided pergola at the bottom of her garden, open, you know, to the fresh air, right, whatever the temperature might be. But she also commanded huge respect and loyalty. She had a number of colleagues, most notably Richard Kahn at King's, to whom she was very close and worked very closely with. Actually, whenever a bit of maths was required, actually Richard did the maths, to be honest. So there was that degree of support. But she was attacked a lot. But it is extraordinary. I mean, for example, when she was having the great controversy with MIT and with Paul Samuelson and so on, Samuelson still respected Joan. So, for example, he wrote an article in, I think, about 1964, which was at the bottom of the, you know, introducing the article, he says, this article is to commemorate Joan Robinson's epic visit to MIT. And then he said, well, he disagreed with her. So there was a degree of respect from her colleagues in what is really quite a rough and tumble world, academic economics. It can be very rude indeed. It certainly was here in Cambridge when I was doing economics in Cambridge. But then I was asked about Joan's teaching style. Yes, I mean, she loved discussion. There's no doubt about that. I mean, she absolutely loved being surrounded by undergraduates, and she always assumed that you were on the same level as she was. I mean, there was no talking down. I remember that I was a visiting professor, in 1976, I think it was, or 78, at UMass Amherst in the United States. And Joan turned up. And I said, would she tell them a little bit about theory? And she said, okay, I'm going to talk about the Treasury Review of 1937. And a bunch of American undergraduates, the Treasury Review of 1930, what is this? So I sort of butted in and pointed out what the Treasury, anyhow, and then went on. But she loved discussion. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I wrote a book with her, which was a singularly terrifying experience. But it was an experience which was of mutual discussion. I mean, Joan at that time was in her 60s. I was about, I don't know, 25, 26, something like that. And it was extraordinary, actually. So she was someone who, I mean, she really thought economics was important. And if you wanted to talk about economics, she'd love to talk to you. I was asked about government insights today. Well, it was in the discussion of the new mercantilism at the end that I tried to illustrate the way in which the analysis which she developed and presented in her inaugural lecture is very relevant to understanding international trade issues today and the dilemmas which we are facing as the global rules-based system, let us say at the very least, is challenged and maybe is fragmenting. And so that sort of insight which sees the determination of effective demand as the key and sees, therefore, the responsibility of governments to ensure, either by cooperative behavior between them or as policies within their own national sphere, that demand is maintained, is central. And don't be fooled because there are lots of Mac jobs. There's another insight of hers. A lady asked about digital technology. Now, let us suppose that the UK economy, indeed the world economy, consists of one big automated factory. And there is one person employed who comes in the morning and switches on and comes out in the evening and switches off. And that produces all the goods and services, including cutting your hair and nursing, whatever it might be. But just suppose it produces everything, okay? Then this economy would have a dilemma. There's this one guy who works there, turns it on and off. Therefore, he or she receives all the income. Who is going to buy the product? This economy can't work. Somebody has to buy all this stuff. And so somehow, if you have a system in which goods and services are produced automatically, and the income derived from those goes to Amazon or Facebook or Google, you have to find some way of redistributing part of the income that the owners of those goods have to maintain demand. Because otherwise, in the end, there'll be nobody to buy the stuff. And so the challenge of the digital world, of managing the digital economy, is how we distribute the benefits of the high productivity of a digital economy broadly throughout the economy, because otherwise, it'll just go into recession, because there'll be nobody to buy the stuff. So the basic demand story is the same, I think comes through. I was then asked about Joan's politics. I didn't talk about her politics very much. Joan was always a very left-wing but very independent person. In the 1950s and 60s, she became somewhat notorious as a great supporter of Maoist China, and was attracted to a sort of organized societies. And there's no doubt that she saw Maoist China in a sort of rather romantic way, and that looking back on what actually happened in the Maoist era, one should say that this romanticism actually had blinkers and didn't really see some of the reality in that world. But just on politics, doing this, I looked up, as everybody does, the sort of serious academic discussions of Joan Robinson's work, namely Wikipedia. And Wikipedia says at the beginning that she came under the influence of Maurice Dobb. This is completely untrue. Maurice Dobb, whom I knew well as well, Maurice was famous as being an old Carthusian, been at Charterhouse, and on the Central Committee of the British Communist Party. And he was a communist in Cambridge, and quite straightforward about it, but taught very orthodox economics, actually, and wore, I remember, thick, very well-tailored tweed suits, and was sort of quite a gent, really. And there are stories that associate Dobb with the Cambridge spies and so on, and I don't know whether they're true or not. But it is certainly untrue that Joan was significantly influenced by Dobb. Certainly in all the time that I knew her, and indeed in some of the older folks who knew her earlier, whom I knew. That's just wrong. And, but she was, in many ways, ultra-leftist in politics, and as I said, did have this very rosy view of Maoist China. So it was a particular politics. And she wrote several things on China and economic development and so on, many of which are extremely interesting and have useful insights. But I must say I would depart from her on some of her, what I think, gosh, I wouldn't have dared say it to her, rather more romantic political views.
Thank you so much. I want to, just for us to thank John, but also this morning, I don't know if I can mention this, but John donated us a very nice drawing of Joan Robinson, which, if anybody wants to see it, is in my office. I'm not going to tell the college curator. But thank you for the talk, and thank you so much for the donation. I certainly have learned a lot. Thanks, John.